Alrighty, so I'm just going to go ahead and start this off. This is the beginning of my stream as well as everything else. I need to make a clarification video because apparently some people did not understand how I made a particular video, and there's a correction that I need to make about something I said in that video. Those two things together, I don't want to do this very often because it can seem like I'm lashing out at my own audience when I do this, but that's not what I'm wanting to do, especially because the video that I'm going to be talking about was one that was literally about adding utility to our utility belt. And that's not the way people have taken it. So that means that I have explained something poorly. So what am I talking about? Well, the video that I'm talking about is the one where I talked about illiberal democracies. Now, an illiberal democracy is a democracy that does not operate under the normal pretenses of a democracy. So for the context of this, you have two kinds of democracies. Democracy, as we understand it, usually comes out of liberal politics. But as much as I could give the description of it in the video, I basically explained that illiberal democracy is a democracy that doesn't actually have free and fair elections anymore and has started to erode a lot of the protections that a liberal democracy is supposed to give. Apparently, that idea was not well received by people. There is a comment that I want to go over that actually explains what's going on really, really well and clarifies things in a way that I didn't do. So let's go ahead and take a look at that. Or it's just not going to work. That's fantastic. I love when all of my stuff does not function simply because we added a RAM stick that didn't end up working. That is my favorite. I love that more than anything in the world. Okay, there we go. Let's go ahead and take a look at this comment. This one's from Under the Dice. By the way, when I'm using any of these comments, when I'm talking about any of these comments, I am not trying to bash any of these people. I don't want you to attack any of these people. I want to respond to them in a way that I feel is important. And in this case, actually, this person is clarifying things that I failed at personally. He said, "Hey, Suris, you misunderstood what liberal in illiberal democracy means. Said it's not a vague concept. It is a specific usage from polity philosophy. Polity philosophy, or the philosophy of who is and ought to be involved in politics, has three fundamental philosophies: corporatism, populism, and liberalism. Corporatism is the world works well when everybody does the job they are meant to have. Example, society is a body and each societal role an organ. As the lungs shouldn't try to be bones, farmers shouldn't try to be architects. They differ in what line they draw in the sand as far as roles are concerned and by which categories they divide as humans. Populism, instead, says politics is wielding power against the friend enemy, the other that is not the enemy enough to wage war against. The strategy of the how may change due to circumstances and beliefs, but ultimately it will always be about wielding power." This one actually is sort of in line with how I feel about politics. I think that politics is a form of power. You are trying to amass power either in the hands of the few or the hands of the many. I'm a socialist. I prefer that power being in the hands of the many. So, okay. And then they said liberalism, politics isn't about people, but ideas. People are just carriers of ideas. You do politics by convincing people. Democracies arise within the context of liberal thinking. So, okay. This is using a different definition of liberal than I used in there because there are a bunch of ways you can use the word liberal, right? There's liberal the way conservatives think it is, where it's like every vaguely socialist thing is liberal. Then you've got liberal in the terms of what it's kind of understood as, generally speaking, where it's like vaguely progressive, vaguely freedoms. And then you've got liberal in terms of like the actual political philosophy that tends to be very pro-capitalism, but really tries to favor like individual choices. So, okay. This version of liberalism, for what they're using, says politics isn't about the people, but it's about the ideas. Democracies only arise within a context of liberal thinking. So, democracies are an attempt to convince people about who should lead us, so naturally a democracy would only arise from that liberal thinking. I get that. If you're using the terms that way, that's fine. My issue is that these terms are used so many different ways. I used a different method. Now, maybe that method isn't as accurate as it could be. That's only fair. They said that democracies only arise in a liberal mindset, but once the democracy is established, it can become seen as the natural state of the world for corporatists or as the battleground of politics for populists. This is what an illiberal democracy is, a democracy that no longer runs on liberal logic despite its origins. So it's no longer about convincing people. It is now a battleground, or it is a area of the natural state of the world where people get sorted into their sharks and minnows categories. Sure. Is that a true illiberal democracy operates as such for its own intrinsic reasons and not as a show for the international stage? Okay, so, man, this is one of those ones that I agree with and disagree with, because, like, in a vacuum, sure, but the reason that I used the term illiberal democracy, the reason that I'm starting to like that term a lot, is because it describes a democracy that uniquely can argue plausible deniability if anybody from within or without would want to take it down. With fascism, you don't have the same plausible deniability once it's fully taken hold, because everybody can kind of see that it's vaguely authoritarian, and now suddenly you're not going to be on board with it as much, unless you are one of the people who was convinced, or one of the people who's basically being held hostage by that fascist state. And a liberal democracy, on the other hand, can convince even the constituents from within that democracy that it is a perfectly reasonable and legitimate form of government. It can convince people from without that its elections are free and fair, even though they are not free and fair anymore the way that a liberal democracy should have them. Again, not different definition of liberal, using their definition of liberal specifically. So I agree, and I actually want to thank you for the comment, but I do hold umbrage here because for its own intrinsic reasons, one of those intrinsic reasons can be putting on the show for the international stage, because that is a thing that prevents you from having a foreign invader try to start a regime change, or a regime change coming in from underneath. They said that China is absolutely an illiberal democracy, but not everybody agrees that Russia is. Okay, that's entirely fair, but not everybody agrees that fascism is happening in America, so I don't care about the not everybody agrees. I don't really care about that particular point, because the reason that I like the term is that it is a more undeniable state of how the United States is, whereas fascism, it's easier for people to get into the mud and argue and try to point and say, like, we're not Nazi Germany, therefore we're not fascist. And like, okay. There's a few other comments in here that I wanted to talk about because they brought up points that I thought were important. This one comment says, changing terms will only be a temporary solution until the fascists notice and make it enter the realm of thought-stopping words. Also, the instant they catch you, you open your flank for a debate on terminology, which will kill any hope about talking about the actual topic. I don't agree with this take. Mostly because no matter what term is used, you have this problem, so you use the term that this problem becomes a non-issue. If every term has this problem, then this problem is one that ought be ignored. Instead, we use the term that is likely to convince more people. Now, there is a point to be made. Sarah Chikorita in my chat actually used a term that I pushed back on at first, because my understanding of this was based on doing some reading and looking at the history of the term. But the term that she brought up was pseudo-democracy, and I think that you might be able to convince more conservatives with the term pseudo-democracy, actually. Despite the fact that illiberal democracy is the accurate term, it is the term that would be accepted if you were, like, writing a paper on this, pseudo-democracy is probably a term that more people are gonna... Man, I want to say more people will grok, but I feel like that word's been tainted by Elon Musk, so more people will immediately understand what you're talking about when you say a pseudo-democracy. And if you point out, you know, China's, quote, free and fair elections despite being effectively a one-party state, they might understand kind of where you're coming from there. So, okay. I am willing to accept that changing terms is only a temporary solution. I also believe that that is the case for any term that we use. So let's go with the term that has utility. We have the comment that I read right before going live. And this one's from Galaxy Muffin. Again, do not attack any of these people. I am perfectly able to defend myself and my own ideas without any of you doing that. I never want to be the content creator that sends people at other people, but I also, yeah, details. Anyway, they said, this is fucking stupid. This civility politicking when we're dealing with evil is stupid. You can't convince MAGA. MAGA are sheep that will do whatever the God King says. Softer language doesn't work. It's irrelevant what word you use, so you might as well describe them accurately. Again, I feel like maybe this is a case where you didn't watch the video, because the point of that video is not to say, let's use softer language because it will convince more people. At no point did I make that claim, at least not that I remember. I do these live. Maybe I said something weird while hip firing. Somebody's going to do a, takedown dunk of me if I did. But may I clarify, this is not civility politics. Using a term that more accurately describes our current lived reality, because fascist does not accurately describe it to, for everybody that understands fascism, you can say, hey, the United States is not necessarily a fascist country. It is an imperialist country. It is rapidly becoming a illiberal democracy. It is ran by a fascist. But to argue that our country is the same as what people commonly understand a fascist country to be, I don't think is going to work. And again, my point was that if a fascist wanted to create a system where they could maintain power like a fascist, but not have it usurped away from them by foreign powers or powers within, you would use a more insidious route. So, what is that insidious route? Well, it's illiberal democracy, or, pseudo-democracy, if you want to use that term. Axo says, you literally said, I fear people will think I'm trying to soften what we call them. Not exactly that. If that's what it was, again, my memory ain't great and it ain't long, but I don't remember making the point that we need to soften our language. So when they say that this is civility politicking, it's not. The point is not to be civility politicking. I don't think civility politics works. Asterisk. So I don't think civility politics works, but I also feel like you lead more flies to a pot with honey than you do with vinegar. So yeah, civility politics is stupid, but you also should look at whatever audience you are talking with and use what is going to make them respond better. And again, this is where the idea of using illiberal democracy or pseudo-democracy is coming from. And I'm perfectly fine accepting that pseudo-democracy is probably a better term. This is like trying to get people on board with the anarcho-syndicalism that Vosh uses by using the term super-capitalism. Is the same shit. This is the same shit. So, sure, we'll call it pseudo-democracy if that term has more utility. I don't care what term is used. I just know that there are terms that people do not agree on even in scholarship, and that creates issues. Again, I said multiple times in the video that Donald Trump himself is a fascist. He has the ideology of a fascist, and it is very, very obvious when you parse his actions and the actions of his administration with himself. The country, largely, not so much, and we don't need to be convincing people about how good or bad Donald Trump is, because that is focusing on the last war and not focusing on the current war. Donald Trump is temporary. He's either going to die or his term is going to be over, and we have to be prepared for whoever the fuck they're going to send next. The problem we will always run into is a competent Donald Trump. We do not want a competent Donald Trump. We have Nirishi the Sable saying, yeah, because they were listening to us before. They make up slurs and slanderous nicknames for us and accuse us of doing the same when all we're describing is what they're doing, which is following the playbook of fascism. You were the we need to play dirty, use their weapons no matter how sinister guy. Where'd that spirit go? Are we going high again now? I feel... Okay, so in this series of run-on sentences, I feel like maybe once more, this is somebody who watched a video and then didn't hear what I said, arguing that we need to add another term that probably has more utility to our repertoire is not walking away from my current method of doing politics. It's not going high when they go low. There's nothing about... Man, I will even make the case that an illiberal democracy is scarier than fascism, because fascism, on its surface, can be argued to be illegitimate. Illiberal democracy is so much harder to argue is illegitimate from within or from without because it has all of the trappings of legitimate for the people government. Because of that, it is a far more insidious enemy. And by that logic, it is at least as bad, if not worse, than fascism would be. Because, with fascism, it's far easier to point to the enemy and go, there they are. Axo says they haven't really been making new slurs. No, they kind of use the same slurs. I hate how often I have to say this. BreadTube and online anarchists seem entirely oblivious to the fact that the vast majority of Americans hear liberal and think radical leftist. I don't think that's true, actually. I really don't. So, the reason I don't think that's true is because in our society, we do not have a majority conservative population. We have a lot of people who consider themselves moderate, and we have a lot of people who are left of the American center. They don't think liberal is radical leftist at that point. Your MAGAs, your conservatives, maybe, but not all of those people. Said your choice of term would be worse than useless in common discourse because conservatives will hear illiberal and think it's a badge of honor. This is echo chamber thinking, Suris. How is it echo chamber thinking when I'm literally trying to think of using a term that is specifically utilized to point out a more insidious form of all of the bad parts about fascism? The window dressing that it is able to use to do all of the bad things fascists do without being called out for it as much. I don't see how that's echo chamber thinking. But again, maybe to your point, there is something to be said about how, like you said, the term illiberal would be seen as a badge of honor. And if that is the case, I'm willing to concede that point by referring to the term that Sarah Chikorita used, pseudo-democracy. I am perfectly willing to use that term instead of illiberal democracy if it has more utility. I do not give a shit what term is used. I care that the term has more utility. And in this case, the utility is a combination of accurately describing the state of America and getting people on our side against that thing. Sarah Chikorita saying LOL in the chat. Yeah, again, if you want to do pseudo-democracy, that's fine. I want to point out that she is where I pulled that term from, whereas reading on this is where I pulled the other term from. If you want to call it echo chamber thinking, I don't see how. Said fascism is hard to explain. Well, so is illiberal democracy. Not really. An illiberal democracy is a democracy on the surface, but its beating heart is not that. Fascism is, by its nature, a loose set of principles that aren't all necessarily adhered to create a fascist state or fascist leader. And, man, if you want to make that point, then all of these terms are hard to explain, and they all have equal utility in terms of needing to expound on them. And at that point, illiberal democracy or pseudo-democracy is going to have the same, if not more, utility here. But okay. Said, in a vacuum, I'd laud you for at least having your heart in the right place. Different terms work for different people. Someone who actually knows what liberal means will understand you. Thing is, again, that's almost nobody that you're trying to reach / not offend. Okay, that's fair. That's a different statement than the majority of the country. That's the people that I'm trying to reach, because I don't give a shit about talking to leftists about things specifically. I would rather have the conversations go and hit conservative ears so that they hear a different perspective and maybe change. I'm not saying we should throw fascism at every single rural, conservative, and suburban moderate as an insult, but for as long as that's exactly what MAGA and the GOP are striving for, it should not leave our vocabulary just because an enemy is disingenuous. They'll just move the goalpost again, like they always do. That is fair, but like the last time somebody made the point about they'll move the goalposts, they'll change the rules. Again, if the word illiberal democracy accurately describes things, then that is a perfectly viable term to use. I don't think fascists should leave our vocabulary. And the reason for that is very simple. I believe that our country's leader is a fascist. period. So there's no world in which I think that that term should leave our vocabulary. But it should be within our vocabulary in the use case where we can point out, hey, we don't want America to turn into this. And much like how if Bernie Sanders became the leader of America today, we wouldn't suddenly become socialist. Soccer says the word liberal is frequently used by right-wingers as a synonym for leftist. Again, I agree with that. But when somebody says the vast majority of Americans here, that's different than when they say the people that you are trying to reach / not offend. Because the vast majority of Americans are not conservatives. There's a reason why when we have higher voting numbers, Democrats tend to win more. And it's because the vast majority of America are not conservative, but a significant portion of them do feel disenfranchised. There's another longer post in here, said this is arguably the dumbest take you could have. For starters, trying to change our terms from calling this fascist situation illiberal will just read as regular conservative. Sure, pseudo-democracy then. Like, there we are. Pseudo-democracy. We'll read that way to libs and conservatives alike. Do you really think the term illiberal will read that way to liberals? It'll literally only result in these folks you're trying to convince to rally behind Trump instead of against him because they see the word liberal as leftist / socialist. So changing terms to argue that everybody decrying the Trump regime and MAGA at large as fascistic were a bunch of alarmists. Okay, so there's a difference. The Trump regime, Trump, his cabinet, what he is trying to do, that is fascist. I am not arguing for abandoning that. That has utility. But our country and how we function is closer to illiberal democracy. So, again, use the term pseudo-democracy if you want, and then point out how pseudo-democracy can easily turn into fascism. Even argue it as a transitionary state. Do the opposite of what, like, hardline Marxists do with socialism, where they feel like socialism is a transitionary state between now and communism. Sure, do the exact same thing. I do not care. I do not care. I care that the term has utility. I care that we use a term that is convincing. That is all it is. So, fair. I do appreciate the feedback. I really do. And it's why I am amending my statement to, if you feel like the term pseudo-democracy will be better understood, will be better accepted, then that's fine. That is entirely okay. Like with all things, speak based on the audience that you are talking to. If you are talking to a hardline MAGA, use the term pseudo-democracy. And when you use the term pseudo-democracy, point out that even you think we don't have free and fair elections. Because you believe that Donald Trump had the election stolen from him in 2020. You already believe we live in a pseudo-democracy, so why do you want that to get worse? If that is what you feel is going to work better, then sure, absolutely. So to argue that Trump's fascist regime is illiberal democracy is to argue that this regime is indistinguishable from prior U.S. presidencies, and in so doing, minimizes the atrocities that the current regime has committed. I know you can do better, and as a public figure and leftist YouTuber, you ought to do so. So I have two inclinations here. One of them is to do the, like, hyper-defensive, how dare you, fuck off my platform, go down that entire shtick, but there's no reason to do that. Because you have a point. You have a point. I do not think that the term illiberal democracy says that this regime is indistinguishable from prior U.S. presidencies, because I think it is fair to point out how this is a worsened state of an already bad state that we were in. Like, America was not great in the Clinton years, and it wasn't great in the Bush years, and it wasn't great in the Obama years, and it wasn't great in the other Bush years. Like, I don't think it minimizes those atrocities, but if you feel it does, I understand, and again, I offer the term from Sarah, pseudo-democracy, as a term with utility that might be able to do this. Sakura says, for a lot of right-wingers, they see Trump trying to cheat as a good thing, and Trump's claims that the Democrats cheated as a bad thing. Then you're having to convince people that it's... At that point, the conversation has to be, why is it good when your guy does it? Access is I have a thing I want to bring up, but I need to put the thoughts together. That is very fair. That is very fair. I don't think there were any more comments in here that I wanted to respond to specifically. Those were the ones that jumped out at me and had, in some cases, very, very salient criticism that I wanted to go over. So, again, TLDR, For the wrap-up of the video, I believe the term illiberal democracy has utility. I do not believe that it has perfect utility. Just like the term fascist has utility, but I don't believe it has perfect utility. Use the term that is going to work best in the situation that you are in. For a good alternative term, consider pseudo-democracy, as it is what you are dealing with China. Arguably, it is what you are dealing with Russia. Anytime you have this facade of a democratic system, that is a form of illiberal or pseudo-democracy. If you feel like that term is better, feel free to use it. For anybody who believes that my take was to put the kid gloves on, I do not mean to be insulting when I say this. Please, for the love of God, gain a measure of media competency or literacy, or whichever one you would like to put here. Using a different term, throwing a different term into our repertoire is not putting the kid gloves on. Call a fascist when it's doing a fucking fascist thing. If you feel that's kid gloves, I don't know what you consider kid gloves then. Maybe let me know in the comment section below. But that's all I wanted to say there. Maybe this video is going to get me a bunch of people unsubbing. Maybe it's going to get the people who disagreed with me to go, oh, you're actually modifying your position based on our critique. That's cool. I'm not 100% sure which one I want. I don't care. I care that we win. That's what I want, because a world where we win is a world where people have health care. It's a world where trans people aren't getting fucking annihilated or sterilized or thrown into mental institutions. It's a world where autistic people aren't being, like, argued to go into fucking work camps by RFK. I want us to win. Whatever method does that, cool. Hey, you made it to the end. I want to give an extra thanks to the patrons who allow me to do this full time. I want to thank Aaron Rail, Astral, Britzkrieg, Jemshin, Poundini, Red Joker, Victoria, Jonas, Craig, Tarika, Fireshard, Smiling GM, John, Dren Hadamada, Creeper, Sagitta, you know I'm not saying that last part, Sylvie Snow, Valis of Seraph, Ottoman Angel, Rooster Rachel, and Fire Panda, who are all my $20 and up patrons.